I want to tell you something before this story starts. And I need you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to share with you isn't the kind of thing you'll find in a dime novel or painted on some theater backdrop in St. Louis. This is about a man who wrote a letter to a woman he'd never met, and a woman who answered it with hands that were already shaking. It's about what happens when two broken people agree, on paper, in ink that's smudged because her fingers were wet with tears, to try being whole together. Not because they loved each other. They didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if I'm being honest about how these things sometimes go. He drove 41 miles to a train station in the desert to pick up a wife. He brought wildflowers. He'd combed his hair for the first time in 3 weeks. He had a speech prepared, 4 sentences, rehearsed so many times they'd lost all meaning. She came off that train on a stretcher, and everything he thought he knew about what it means to need somebody, and to be needed, Christ, it all just burned away like fog over the mesa at sunrise. You think you know what carrying someone means. You pick them up, you walk, you set them down. That's what I thought, too, before I became the man in this story. I was wrong. Carrying someone isn't a single act. It's a decision you make with your legs and your lungs and the part of your chest that aches when you breathe in too deep. And you keep making it, step after step after step, not because you're strong. Because you're terrified of what happens if you stop. This is how it started. I'll tell you exactly what I remember about September 14th, 1883, because I wrote it down. I write everything down. It's a sickness, maybe, or a habit so old it might as well be bone. But I've kept a leather ledger since I was 19 years old, and in it I record the things that happened to me with the kind of precision that other men reserve for prayer. September 14th. Sunrise at 6:12. Temperature at dawn, 51 degrees. Wind from the southwest, steady, carrying the smell of creosote and something metallic I couldn't name. I hitched the wagon at 4:40 in the morning, fed the roan mare 3 scoops of oats instead of 2 because the drive to Arroyo Station was 41 miles, and I didn't want her flagging halfway. I loaded a trunk of clean linens, a jug of water, a second jug of water because I am, and always have been, the kind of man who plans for what might go wrong, even on the days when everything is supposed to go right. In the ledger I wrote, going to meet C. Whitfield. Train arrives 2:15 p.m. That was all. As if picking up a mail-order bride from a train platform were no different than collecting a shipment of fence wire. Maybe I wrote it that way on purpose. Maybe I was afraid that if I wrote what I actually felt, the knot below my sternum, the ridiculous trembling in my hands, the way I'd reread her letters so many times the paper was soft as cloth, I would jinx it. I don't believe in jinxes. I don't believe in much of anything, if I'm honest, except the weight of a shovel and the stubbornness of mesquite roots, and the fact that a man alone on 400 acres of New Mexico scrubland will eventually talk to his horse like she's a person, because she's the only one listening. Her name was Clara N. Whitfield from Chillicothe, Ohio, schoolteacher, widow. 29 years old, though her handwriting looked older, careful and controlled. Each letter formed with the kind of deliberateness that suggested she was used to being watched and judged. She'd answered my advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, which I'd placed 6 months earlier after my neighbor Harlan Briggs told me, over a bottle of rye whiskey that neither of us should have been drinking, that a man my age had no business dying alone. "You're 34, Caleb," Harlan had said, pointing at me with the neck of the bottle. "You got a ranch, you got teeth, you got all your fingers. That's more than most. Write the damn letter." So I did, 47 words. I counted them afterward because that's what I do, I count things. 47 words to summarize a life and make it sound like something a woman might want to walk into. Clara wrote back 11 days later. Her letter was 3 pages long, and by the second paragraph I knew 2 things. She was smarter than me, and she was running from something. Not running the way a person runs from a fire, urgent, panicked. Running the way a river runs. Steady and inevitable, and with the quiet understanding that stopping isn't really an option. Her husband, a mine foreman named Gerald, had died in a shaft collapse in the winter of '81. She didn't describe the collapse. She described the sound his boots made on the porch every evening at 6:15, and then the silence that replaced it, and how silence, she said, wasn't the absence of something but the presence of it. Silence was a thing that moved into your house and sat in your husband's chair and ate at your husband's plate, and followed you into every room until you couldn't remember what noise sounded like. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I wrote back, 39 words this time. I told her about the ranch, the sky, the way the light fell across the mesa at dusk. I told her I had a dog named Bishop who was missing one ear and didn't care for strangers. I told her I was not a good talker, but I was a decent listener, and that my house had 3 rooms and a fireplace that drew well. She wrote again, and 6 letters later she agreed. I remember the exact moment I read her acceptance. I was standing in the kitchen, boots still on, hat still on, holding the letter in both hands. Bishop was lying on the floor chewing the leg of a chair I hadn't gotten around to fixing. The light coming through the window was amber and dusty, and it fell across the page like something holy, though I wouldn't have used that word then. My hands were shaking. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who shakes. I've pulled calves from dying mothers in blizzards. I've set my own broken finger with a strip of rawhide and a stick. I once shot a rattlesnake off the porch rail at 12 feet without spilling my coffee, but standing in my kitchen reading a letter from a woman I'd never met who had agreed to share my life, I shook like a man with fever. I wrote in the ledger that night. She said yes. 3 words, the most important 3 words I'd ever recorded. The drive to Arroyo Station took 9 hours. I left before dawn and arrived just after 1 in the afternoon, which gave me time to water the mare, wash my face at the pump behind the station house, and stand on the platform like a fool with a fistful of wildflowers I'd picked along the road. Purple asters. They were already wilting in the heat, and I held them at my side with my arms straight and stiff, the way a soldier holds a rifle during inspection. The station was nothing. A wooden platform, a ticket window, a water tower with rust stains running down the legs like old blood. 2 benches. A telegraph office attached to the side that leaned slightly eastward, as though the building itself were trying to escape the sun. There were 4 other people waiting. A cattle buyer from Las Cruces, a woman with 2 children who looked exhausted in the way that only mothers of small children can look, and an old man sleeping on one of the benches with his hat over his face. I stood apart from all of them and tried to remember the speech I'd prepared. Welcome, Mrs. Whitfield. I hope your journey was comfortable. The ranch is a half-day's ride. I've made supper, 4 sentences. I'd said them so many times on the drive that they'd turned to sounds without meaning, like words in a language I didn't speak. The train came at 2:23, 8 minutes late. I know because I checked my watch 4 times in the last 10 minutes, which I recorded later in the ledger with a note that said, simply, "Watch works fine." Problem is the man holding it. I heard it before I saw it, the low moan of the whistle, then the grinding of iron on iron, then the hiss of steam that always reminded me of a horse exhaling after a hard run. The locomotive came around the bend slow and heavy, dragging 6 cars behind it like a beast too tired to care about dignity. Doors opened. People stepped out. The cattle buyer met a man in a brown suit. The mother with the children ran to a tall man who swept one child onto his shoulder and kissed the other on the forehead, and for a moment I watched them and felt something I won't name because naming it would make it too real. I waited. More passengers emerged, a drummer with a sample case, 2 soldiers in blue wool sweating through their collars. An elderly couple moving slowly, carefully, as though the platform might collapse beneath them. No Clara. I waited longer. The flowers were dying in my hand. The asters had gone limp, the stems bending like tired necks. I shifted my weight from one boot to the other, a habit I have when I'm nervous, and I counted the rivets on the nearest rail car because counting things calms me, and I got to 47, the same number as the words in my advertisement, which felt like a coincidence that meant something, though I couldn't say what. Then the conductor appeared at the door of the 3rd car. He was a heavy man with a red face and a mustache that looked like it had been borrowed from someone more distinguished. He leaned out and looked up and down the platform, and then he looked directly at me. "You Mercer," he called. "I am." He disappeared back inside. A moment later he returned, and he wasn't alone. He was supporting a woman, half carrying her, really, with one arm around her waist and her arm draped over his shoulder. Behind them, a porter held a single carpet bag that looked like it had been through a war. The woman was barely standing. Her feet moved, but they weren't supporting her weight. They were just going through the motions of walking, touching the floor of the car, and then lifting again with the mechanical futility of a clock's pendulum. Her dress was gray, or had been gray once. Now it was stained with something dark at the hem and wrinkled so deeply it looked like the fabric had given up the same way her legs had. Her hair was brown and loose, falling around her face in strings that stuck to her skin. She was thin, not slender. Thin. The kind of thin that isn't a shape but a warning. I could see the bones of her wrists, the hollows of her cheeks, the way her collarbones stood out beneath the fabric of her dress like the frame of a tent with no canvas. The conductor got her to the top of the steps and stopped. He looked at me again with an expression I would later identify as relief, the relief of a man handing a burden to someone else. "She's been sick since Kansas City," he said. "Fever, wouldn't eat. We did what we could." I dropped the flowers. I don't remember deciding to drop them. My hand just opened, and the asters fell to the platform and lay there in the dust and the heat, and I stepped forward and climbed the 3 steps to the car door, and I looked at her face for the first time. Her eyes were open. That's what I remember most. Not the fever flush on her skin or the cracked dryness of her lips or the way her body trembled with the effort of remaining upright. Her eyes. They were green, a deep, tired green, like moss on a stone that's been underwater for a long time, and they were looking at me with an expression that I have spent every day since trying to understand. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hope. It wasn't gratitude or desperation, or any of the things you'd expect to see on the face of a woman who traveled 1,800 miles to meet a stranger and arrived too weak to stand. It was an apology. She was apologizing, without words, without movement, with nothing but the angle of her eyebrows and the slight downward pull at the corner of her mouth. She was saying, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I'm not what you expected. I'm sorry I can't stand. I'm sorry I'm broken and sick and too thin and not the woman in the letters, not really, not anymore. I want you to understand something." In that moment, standing on those wooden steps with the sun hitting the back of my neck and the steam hissing beneath the car and the smell of coal and iron and sickness filling my nose, in that moment, I did not think about the letters. I did not think about the 47-word advertisement, or the wildflowers, or the speech I'd prepared, or the clean linens in the wagon, or the supper waiting at the ranch. I did not think about any of it. I thought she weighs less than a calf. And then I picked her up. One arm under her knees, one arm behind her back. Her head fell against my shoulder with the kind of surrender that only comes when a person has been holding themselves together for so long that the act of being held by someone else breaks whatever was keeping them upright. She weighed nothing. I want to be precise about this because precision matters to me, and I wrote it in the ledger that night, carried her off the train. Estimate 95 pounds, maybe less. A grown woman, 29 years old, who weighed less than the sacks of feed I threw over the fence every morning without thinking. I carried her down the steps, across the platform, past the old man still sleeping on the bench, past the spot where the wildflowers lay dying in the dust, past the water tower with its rust stains, to the wagon where the roan mare stood flicking her tail at flies with the supreme indifference of an animal who does not care about human dramas. I set her in the wagon bed, on the linens I'd brought, and I propped her head on a folded blanket, and I gave her water from the jug, tipping it slowly against her lips because her hands couldn't hold the cup. She drank 3 swallows and then turned her head away, and her eyes closed, and for a terrible, airless moment I thought she had died. She hadn't. Her chest rose, fell, rose again. The rhythm was shallow and uneven, like a candle flame in a draft, but it was there. The conductor handed me the carpet bag. "There's a doctor in Mesilla," he said, "if she makes it." If she makes it. I wrote that in the ledger too later with a hand that was steady because the shaking had stopped. The shaking stops when the situation becomes too serious for shaking. I've noticed that. Fear is a luxury of anticipation. Once the thing you fear is actually happening, something else takes over, something colder, quieter, more efficient, something that doesn't shake. I drove the 41 miles back in the dark. I didn't push the mare. I took every rut and washout slow, keeping the wagon as level as I could, and every few minutes I looked back at her lying on the linens and I checked for the rise and fall of her chest. I counted her breaths the way I count fence posts and rivets and the words in my letters, because counting is how I hold the world together when it's trying to come apart. She woke twice during the drive. The first time she said something I couldn't hear. Her voice was so thin it got lost in the creak of the wagon wheels. I leaned back and said, "You're safe, Mrs. Whitfield. We're going home." And I felt foolish saying it because she didn't know me and I didn't know her, and the word home was a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. The second time she woke, she said one word clearly, "Clara." "Ma'am." "My name, Clara, not Mrs. Whitfield." A pause. "He's dead. She died with him." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. It took me weeks to understand that she wasn't being poetic, she was being precise. Mrs. Whitfield was the wife of Gerald Whitfield, and when Gerald died in that mine shaft in Ohio, Mrs. Whitfield died too. The woman in my wagon wasn't a wife. She was whatever comes after. "Clara," I said, "all right, I'm Caleb." She didn't respond. She'd already gone back under, sinking into the fever like a stone into deep water. And I drove the rest of the way with nothing but the sound of the mare's hooves and the creak of the axles and the enormous, terrifying silence of the desert at night. I got her to the ranch at 3 in the morning. Bishop came out barking, one sharp, alarmed bark, then a confused whimper when he smelled her, and then silence as he followed me through the front door with his one ear flattened against his head. I put her in my bed. I pulled off her boots, which were falling apart, the soles worn through in 2 places. I covered her with every blanket I owned, 3 wool, 1 cotton, and I built the fire in the fireplace until the room was too warm for me but still not warm enough for her because she was shivering. Not trembling, shivering. The deep, bone-level shivering of a body that has forgotten what warmth feels like. I sat in the chair beside the bed and I watched her breathe and I thought, this is not what I planned. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a hero. I'm a rancher with 400 acres of scrubland and a one-eared dog and a ledger full of numbers that nobody will ever read. I placed an advertisement for a wife because I was lonely. And loneliness, when it goes on long enough, becomes a kind of injury, a thing that hurts in a way you stop noticing until someone points it out. Harlan Briggs pointed it out. He said, "You talk to that horse more than you talk to people, Caleb." And I said, "The horse listens better." And he said, "That's not the point and you damn well know it." So I wrote the letters, and Clara wrote back, and in her letters she was articulate and warm and funny. She made a joke in her 3rd letter about the quality of Ohio mud that made me laugh out loud in my kitchen alone at 9 in the evening, and I stood there laughing with nobody to hear it and thought, maybe this could work. But the woman in my bed was not the woman in the letters. The woman in the letters was a person. The woman in my bed was a catastrophe. She was 95 pounds of fever and bone and silence, and I didn't know what to do with her. I made broth. I heated water on the stove and put in the last of the salted beef and some dried onion, and I brought it to her in a tin cup, and I held the cup to her lips the way I'd held the water jug in the wagon, tilting it gently, and she swallowed twice and then coughed, and the cough sounded like something tearing, wet and raw and too deep for her narrow chest. At some point I fell asleep in the chair. When I woke, the fire had burned down to coals and the room was gray with pre-dawn light, and she was looking at me. Just looking. Those green eyes, steady and clear for the first time since the train, watching me from the pillow with an expression that I will now try to describe and fail, because some things don't fit in words the way they don't fit in ledgers. She looked like someone who had expected to die and was surprised, and not entirely pleased, to find herself alive. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice was a husk. "My ranch, 12 miles east of Las Palomas." "New Mexico." "Yes, ma'am, Clara." A silence, then, "How long was I?" "You got off the train yesterday, about 2 in the afternoon. It's near dawn now." She closed her eyes. I watched her process this information, watched the muscles in her jaw tighten and release, watched her swallow with effort. "I ruined it," she whispered. "Ruined what?" "The arrival, the meeting. I'd planned what I was going to say. I was going to shake your hand. I pressed my dress in Dodge City so it would be." She stopped. Her eyes opened, and they were wet, and the wetness caught the firelight and threw it back at me like something I wasn't meant to see. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You expected someone who could stand." "I expected you," I said, and I meant it, though I couldn't have told you exactly what I meant by it. She was, after all, the only person I was expecting. The only woman who had answered my 47 words. The only human being in 1,800 miles of country who had read my clumsy description of a ranch and a dog and a fireplace and thought, yes, I'll go there, I'll try. She closed her eyes again. A tear slid from the corner of her left eye and ran along her temple into her hair, and I pretended not to see it, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is to let them weep without witnesses. I wrote in the ledger that morning. I sat at the kitchen table while she slept, and I recorded everything with the precision that keeps me sane. September 15th. Sunrise 6:13, temperature at dawn 48 degrees. Clara arrived yesterday. She is very sick. Fever, weight loss, cough. Gave broth twice, water 4 times. She slept 12 hours. She apologized for being ill. I told her not to. Dog has not left the bedroom door. Then underneath, in smaller writing, she has green eyes. I did not expect that. That's where the first night ended. With a woman I'd never met sleeping in my bed, and a dog I'd raised from a pup guarding her like she'd always been there, and me sitting at a table with a pencil and a ledger trying to record the weight of something I couldn't measure. I didn't know then what was coming. I didn't know about the weeks of fever and the nights of sitting in that chair, and the morning I would walk out to the woodpile and find an old Apache man sitting on a stump, waiting, as though he'd always known I'd need him. I didn't know that carrying her off that train was only the beginning, that carrying someone, truly carrying them, is not a single act but 1,000 acts, each one smaller and harder than the last, and that the weight doesn't decrease as they heal. It shifts. From your arms to your chest, to the place behind your ribs where your heart does its stubborn, terrified work. I didn't know any of that. I only knew that the fire needed more wood, and the broth needed reheating, and there was a woman in my house who weighed 95 pounds and had green eyes and had apologized for being alive. I got up, I fed the fire, I heated the broth. And I stayed. By the 4th day, I knew 2 things about Clara Whitfield with absolute certainty. She was not going to die quietly, and she was going to fight me on every single thing I tried to do for her. The fever broke on the 3rd night, not gently, not with a slow easing like a river settling after rain, but violently like something snapping. One moment she was shivering under 3 wool blankets and a cotton quilt, her body rattling with the cold that only fevers produce, that cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the body turning against itself. And the next moment she was drenched, soaked through. The sheets, the blankets, the nightgown I'd found in her carpet bag and changed her into with my eyes fixed on the ceiling and my hands shaking so badly I had to stop twice. All of it was wet, and the room smelled like salt and sickness, and she opened her eyes and said, in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged over gravel, "I need to sit up." "You need to lie still." "I need to sit up, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb." "I need to sit up, Caleb, or I am going to scream." She didn't scream, but she sat up, and the effort of it, the way her arms trembled, the way her neck strained, the way her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin, told me that this was a woman who understood pain the way I understood ledgers. Intimately, systematically, as a thing to be catalogued and managed and never, under any circumstances, surrendered to. I helped her to the chair by the fire. She weighed a few pounds more than when I'd carried her off the train, which meant the broth was doing something, but she still felt like a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. She sat in the chair and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the fire with those green eyes, focused now, sharp, no longer fogged by fever, and said, "How many days?" "3. Since the train." 3 days, she said it the way a person says a number they're trying to make real. "I've been here 3 days." "Yes." "And you've been nursing me this entire time." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Bishop, who had stationed himself at the bedroom door like a sentry and only moved when I moved, lay at her feet now with his chin on his paws. She looked down at him, and I saw something shift in her face, some small interior wall coming down, or maybe just developing a crack. "He only has one ear," she said. "Coyote got the other one when he was a pup. He didn't seem to mind, still hears better than I do." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. The ghost of a smile, the memory of what smiling felt like, appearing for just a moment before disappearing again. "I should tell you something," she said. "You don't have to tell me anything." "I do, because you carried me off a train and brought me to your home and fed me and sat in a chair for 3 days watching me breathe, and you deserve to know what you've gotten into." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I was sick before I left Ohio, not this sick, but sick. I had a cough that wouldn't stop, and I'd lost weight, and the doctor in Chillicothe said my lungs were, he used a word. I don't remember the word, something Latin. He said I needed rest and clean air and nutrition, and I had none of those things because Gerald's debts ate everything. The house, the savings, the furniture, everything." She stopped, stared at the fire. "So when I saw your advertisement, a ranch in New Mexico, clean air, open space, I thought, This is either the answer or the end, and I couldn't tell which would be better. I didn't say anything. There are moments when silence is not the absence of speech, but the only speech that matters, and this was one of them. "I should have told you in the letters," she said. "I should have written, 'Dear Mr. Mercer, I am ill and destitute, and I have no family and no prospects, and I am answering your advertisement because I have nowhere else to go and nothing else to try.' But I was so afraid, that if I told you the truth, you wouldn't want me. And then there would be nowhere, no clean air. No open space, her voice cracked, no one." She was crying, not the way she'd cried on the first night, silently, a single tear slipping out like a secret. This was different. This was the kind of crying that a person does when they've been holding something for a very long time and the holding becomes harder than the grief itself. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I poured her water, I held the cup steady, and I waited. When the crying slowed, not stopped, but slowed, the way a storm doesn't stop but loses its urgency, I said, "That doctor in Chillicothe, did he say it was consumption?" She nodded. "Did he say it was certain?" "He said he wasn't sure. He said it could be just the lungs weakened from the dust. The mines, the soot that Gerald used to come home covered in it. Coal dust. It was in everything, the curtains, the food, the water. I breathed it for 6 years." I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. There were 3 water stains I kept meaning to fix, and never did. I counted the edges of the largest one, 7, and filed this information in the part of my mind that stores useless facts alongside useful ones without distinguishing between them. "There's a man," I said slowly, "lives up in the hills about 3 miles northeast. Apache. His name is Nanton. He knows more about lungs and breathing and what grows out of the ground to fix what's broken inside a person than any doctor I've met, and I've met 3, and 2 of them were drunk." Clara looked at me. "An Apache?" "Yes. You're friends with an Apache." "I wouldn't say friends, I'd say we've arrived at an understanding. He doesn't shoot at me. I don't fence off the spring on the North Ridge where his people have been getting water since before my grandfather was born. We nod at each other. Sometimes he leaves things, herbs, roots, a rabbit once skinned and hung on my fence post. I leave things for him, salt, ammunition, a wool blanket last winter when the cold came down hard." She was quiet, then my mother would have fainted. "Your mother's not here." That ghost smile again, a little stronger this time. "No," she said, "she's not. Nanton came on the 6th day. I didn't send for him, that's what you need to understand. I didn't ride up to the hills or leave a message or signal him in any way. He came because he came. He appeared at the edge of the property at dawn, sitting on a brown and white pinto with the stillness of a man who has been sitting still in wild places for so many years that stillness is no longer an effort but a language. I was at the woodpile. I'd been splitting logs for 20 minutes, which I do when I can't think straight, because the axe follows a rhythm that doesn't require thought, lift, swing, split, stack. And the physical work clears the noise in my head the way wind clears smoke. I was thinking about Clara's lungs and the word, consumption. And the way she'd said this is either the answer or the end with a flatness that suggested she'd already decided which one she preferred and was simply waiting to be proven right. I heard the horse before I saw it. Not the hoofbeats, the pinto was too sure-footed for that, but the breath. That soft, warm exhalation that horses make when they're comfortable and unhurried. I turned, and there he was. Nanton was older than me by at least 20 years, maybe more. His face was deeply lined, the kind of lines that aren't wrinkles but topography, evidence of a landscape that has been shaped by wind and sun and time into something that isn't beautiful exactly, but is undeniably significant. His hair was black, threaded with gray, and fell past his shoulders. He wore a cotton shirt, deerskin leggings, and a belt with a sheath knife that I'd seen him use to skin a deer in under 4 minutes. He looked at me, then he looked at the house, then back at me. "You have someone inside," he said. His English was accented but precise. He spoke the way he moved, economically, without waste. "My wife." The word felt strange in my mouth, like wearing a new hat that doesn't quite fit yet. "She came on the train, she's sick." "I know." I waited for him to explain how he knew. He didn't. Nanton had a way of stating facts without providing their origins, as though the how of knowing was less important than the knowing itself. I'd learned, over 4 years of living near him, that asking him to explain was like asking the wind to explain why it blew from the southwest. He'd look at you with an expression that suggested the question was the real mystery, not the answer. "May I see her?" he said. I nodded. He dismounted. The Pinto stayed where it was, untethered, as though it had been told to wait and had no intention of disobeying. We went inside. Clara was awake, sitting in the chair by the fire with the blanket around her shoulders and a cup of broth in her hands that she was holding more for warmth than for drinking. Bishop was at her feet. When Nanton entered, Bishop raised his head, looked at the old man, and put his head back down. This, I understood, was Bishop's endorsement. Clara's reaction was different. She went still, the kind of still that is not calm but alert, every muscle in her body tensing at once. Her eyes moved from Nanton to me and back to Nanton, and I saw the fear in them, plain and unfiltered, and I understood it even as I wished it weren't there. "Clara, this is Nanton. He's a healer. He lives in the hills." Nanton didn't approach her. He stood just inside the door, several feet away, and he looked at her with an expression that I had seen him wear exactly once before, when he'd found a hawk with a broken wing tangled in the mesquite near the North Spring. It was not pity. It was assessment. The careful, practiced evaluation of a man who has spent his life determining what can be healed and what cannot. "You breathe with your mouth," he said to Clara. She blinked. Yes, my nose gets blocked. The passages are swollen from inflammation, not infection." He said this with the certainty of a man reading words off a page that only he could see. "How long?" "Month since winter." He nodded, then he looked at me. "I need to listen to her chest. I will put my ear against her back. Nothing more. Is this acceptable?" He was asking both of us. I looked at Clara. She looked at Nanton for a long moment, really looked at him, the way she'd looked at me on the train, with that green-eyed intensity that seemed to peel back surfaces and examine what lay beneath, and then she nodded. What followed was the most thorough medical examination I had ever witnessed, conducted entirely without instruments. Nanton listened to her breathing from the back, from the sides, from the front. He asked her to cough and listened to the cough, not just the sound, but the vibration of it, pressing his palm flat against her ribs in a way that suggested he was feeling something beneath the surface that his ears alone couldn't catch. He looked at her fingernails. He looked at her tongue. He asked her to breathe deeply and watched the way her chest expanded, or failed to expand. And his face during all of this was the face of a man reading a story in a language he knew fluently. When he was finished, he stepped back and spoke to me in Apache. He did this sometimes, switched languages mid-conversation, not to exclude, but because certain ideas existed more naturally in one language than another. I understood about a third of what he said, which was more than I'd understood a year ago and less than I wanted to understand now. Then he switched to English. "Her lungs are damaged, not destroyed. There is scarring from the dust, the coal dust she breathed. The tissue is thick and stiff in places, like leather that has been left in the rain and dried too many times. But there is healthy tissue underneath. Enough." "Enough for what?" Clara asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were gripping the cup so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "Enough to breathe. Enough to heal if the healing is given time and the right things." He paused. "This land is dry, the air is clean, there is no coal here, no dust from the mines. Your lungs will have what they did not have in Ohio, space. But you must be patient. Patience is the hardest medicine." He told me what to do. Not in a list. Nanton didn't give lists. He told me in the form of a story, the way his people communicated important knowledge, embedding instructions inside narrative so they would be remembered not as rules but as truths. He told me about a plant that grew along the dry creek beds, low to the ground with silver-green leaves and small yellow flowers. He called it by its Apache name, which I wrote in my ledger phonetically and probably misspelled. He said to boil the leaves and have her breathe the steam twice a day, morning and evening, with a cloth over her head to trap the vapor. He said the steam would soften the scarred tissue the way water softens dried leather. Slowly, over weeks, over months. He told me about a root, wild horehound, he called it, though he used the Apache word first, that could be chewed or brewed into a tea. He said it would quiet the cough and let the lungs rest. He said rest was not laziness. He said rest was the body's way of rebuilding what had been broken, the way a river rebuilds its banks after a flood, silently, incrementally, without anyone noticing until one day the bank is there again, solid and whole. He told me to feed her, not just broth, meat, fat, marrow. He said her body was a house with no fuel, and that no house survives a winter without fuel. He said this with such matter-of-fact simplicity that I felt embarrassed for not thinking of it myself. Then he looked at Clara, and he said something that I have carried in my chest for the rest of my life, something I wrote in the ledger that night in letters larger than my usual hand. "You are not broken, you are bent. Bent things straighten. It takes pressure and time and the willingness to hold the shape until the shape holds itself." He left, he walked out the door and mounted the Pinto and rode back toward the hills without saying goodbye, because goodbye was not a concept that held weight for him. He would come back, or he wouldn't. The leaving and the returning were not events to be marked, but movements to be accepted, like the passage of weather. Clara sat in the chair for a long time after he left. Bishop had moved closer during the examination, pressing himself against her legs, and she had one hand resting on his head, her fingers absently scratching the space where his missing ear should have been. "He didn't charge anything," she said. "No. Why?" "I thought about this. I thought about the spring on the North Ridge and the salt I left on the fence post and the rabbit that appeared, skinned and ready, on mornings when I hadn't expected anything." "Because that's not how he works," I said. "He doesn't trade healing for money. He heals because it's what he does, the way I raise cattle." "The way you taught school." "I wasn't very good at teaching." "I doubt that." She looked at me, that green-eyed look, the one that peeled surfaces. "You don't know me well enough to doubt that." "I know you well enough to know that a woman who wrote the letters you wrote, who described Ohio mud with enough wit to make a stranger laugh alone in his kitchen, that woman was a good teacher." She didn't respond, but something in her face changed. Some minute rearrangement of the muscles around her eyes and mouth that altered the entire geography of her expression, the way a single degree of temperature can shift a landscape from ice to water. It wasn't a smile. It was the ground thawing. The weeks that followed were slow and difficult and boring and extraordinary, in ways I didn't recognize at the time because I was too busy living them to understand what they meant. I gathered the plant Nanton had described. I found it along the creek bed, exactly where he said it would be, low, silver green, with yellow flowers that smelled like sage and something sharper underneath, like pepper. I picked it carefully, taking only what I needed, leaving the roots intact the way Nanton had instructed because, and these were his words, "A plant that dies to heal one person cannot heal the next." I boiled the leaves every morning and every evening. I filled a basin with the steaming water and brought it to Clara with a cloth, and she bent over the basin and breathed the vapor, and the first time she did it, she coughed so violently that I nearly grabbed the basin away. But she waved me off with one hand, eyes streaming, and kept breathing. She breathed the steam the way she did everything, with a grim, jaw-clenched determination that suggested she had made a decision about her own survival and was offended by any obstacle to it. The cough eased, not quickly, not dramatically. The way dawn comes, so gradually that you can't point to the exact moment when darkness becomes light, but you look up at some point and realize the world is visible. I fed her. Broth first, then meat cut small and cooked soft, then eggs from the 3 hens I kept behind the house, then bread that I baked myself, and that was, I freely admit, not good bread, flat and dense, and slightly burned on the bottom, but she ate it. She ate everything I put in front of her with the systematic thoroughness of a person who understands that eating is not pleasure but repair. The weight came back, slowly, a pound here, a half-pound there, measured not by scale, I didn't own one, but by observation. The hollows in her cheeks filled. The tendons in her neck became less visible. Her wrists, which had reminded me of bird bones, thickened until I could no longer see every ridge and valley of the underlying structure. And as the weight came back, so did she. The Clara who emerged from the illness was not the Clara of the letters, exactly, but she was adjacent to her, a version shaped by the journey and the sickness and the strange, slow intimacy of being nursed by a stranger. She was sharp, observant. She noticed things I had stopped noticing. The way the light hit the kitchen wall at midday, the pattern of Bishop's breathing when he slept, the specific blue of the sky at the moment before sunset that she called heartbreak blue because she said it was too beautiful to look at without hurting. She asked questions, not the polite, small questions of a guest, but the deep, detailed questions of a person who has decided to understand a thing completely or not at all. She asked about the ranch, every acre, every fence line, every head of cattle. She asked about the water situation, the feed costs, the market prices in Las Cruces. She asked about the soil and the seasons and the way the mesquite grew and whether it was true that you could eat the pods. I answered everything. I gave her the ledger, not the personal entries, but the ranch accounts, the columns of numbers that represented 4 years of solitary work, and she read them with a focus that reminded me of Nanton listening to her lungs. When she was done, she looked up and said, "You're losing money on the south pasture." "I know. The grazing is too thin. The cattle are walking too far for water, which burns weight, which reduces your price per head at market." "I know. Then why haven't you moved them?" "Because moving them means fencing the north pasture, and fencing costs money I'm losing on the south pasture." She stared at me. Then she laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, a real laugh, not the ghost smile or the cracked whisper of amusement, but an actual full laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest and sounded, to my ears, like the first rain after a drought. "That," she said, "is the most circular piece of logic I have ever heard. I've been going in circles for 4 years. You get used to it." She laughed again, and this time I laughed too, and the sound of 2 people laughing in a house that had been silent for so long. The sound filled the rooms the way the steam from Nanton's plant filled the basin, curling into every corner, reaching every surface, softening things that had grown hard. Nanton came back 3 times over the following weeks. Each visit followed the same pattern. He appeared at dawn, examined Clara with his hands and his ears, adjusted the treatment, a different plant here, a change in the tea's strength there, and left without ceremony. On the 3rd visit, Clara followed him outside. I watched from the kitchen window as she stood on the porch, standing on her own feet without holding the rail, which was itself a victory I recorded in the ledger with an exclamation point, the first one I'd ever used, and spoke to him. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw Nanton's face, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw him look surprised. He said something back. She nodded. He reached into the leather bag he carried on his belt and pulled out a small object, I couldn't see what it was from the window, and placed it in her hand. Then he mounted the pinto and rode away. That evening, over supper, real supper now, beef and potatoes, and the bad bread that had become slightly less bad with practice, I asked her what she'd said to him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she placed a small stone on the table between us. It was smooth, river-worn, and pale gray with a single vein of white running through it like a seam. "I asked him why he helped me," she said. "A stranger, a white woman, a person from the people who," she stopped, chose her words carefully, "from the people who have taken so much from his." "What did he say?" "He said that illness doesn't know the color of the skin it lives inside. He said that a healer who chooses which bodies to heal based on anything other than the body's need is not a healer but a judge, and he didn't have the arrogance for that." She turned the stone over in her fingers. Then he said something else. He said, "I heal you because the man who brought you here has never asked me for anything. In 4 years, he has left salt and cloth and ammunition on the fence, and he has never once walked to my fire and asked for anything in return. A man like that, when he finally needs something, deserves to receive it." I didn't say anything. I looked at the stone on the table, and I felt something in my chest that I will describe as heat, though it wasn't physical heat. It was the warmth of being seen by someone you didn't know was watching. I wrote in the ledger that night. October 7th, Clara stood on the porch without assistance. Nanton's 3rd visit, she asked him why he heals her. His answer was about me, but it was really about something larger than both of us, and I don't have the words for it, so I'll just write. The stone is gray with a white vein. I'm keeping it. There were hard days, too. I don't want to smooth this into a story about steady progress and warm feelings, because that's not how it happened, and dishonesty, even in storytelling, is something I can't abide. There were mornings when Clara woke coughing and couldn't stop. Mornings when the cough brought blood, just a little. A streak on her palm, but enough to turn her face white and her eyes wide, and to send me to the barn where I stood gripping a fence rail and breathing hard because I was afraid and I didn't want her to see it. There were afternoons when she wouldn't speak. When she sat in the chair and stared at the wall with an emptiness that frightened me more than the cough. Because illness I could fight, but absence, the retreat of a person into some interior space where you cannot follow, that was beyond my reach. There was the morning she found Gerald's photograph in her carpet bag. A tintype she'd forgotten was there, or maybe hadn't forgotten but had been avoiding, and she held it and wept with a grief so raw and bottomless that I left the house and walked to the North Ridge and stood there looking at the desert for an hour because I understood with a clarity that hurt, that she was not weeping for the man in the photograph. She was weeping for the life the photograph represented. The life before the mind collapsed. The life before the dust. The life where she was Mrs. Whitfield, and that name meant something, and the future was a thing you walked toward rather than a thing you. And I couldn't fix that. No amount of broth or steam or whorehound tea could fix the fact that she had lost a life and was trying to build a new one from materials she hadn't chosen. A stranger's ranch, a stranger's dog, a stranger's hands holding a cup to her lips in the dark. I couldn't fix it, but I could stay, and staying, I was learning, was its own kind of medicine. Winter came to the mesa the way Nanton described everything. Slowly, then all at once, as though the season had been standing just beyond the horizon for weeks, watching, waiting for the precise moment when the land's guard was down before stepping in with both feet. I wrote it in the ledger on November 3rd, first frost, ice on the water trough, 28 degrees at dawn. Clara wore my coat to the henhouse, it reached her knees. That image, Clara in my canvas ranch coat, the hem brushing her kneecaps, her breath visible in the cold air as she gathered eggs from the 3 hens with the careful competence of a woman who had watched me do it for 6 weeks and decided she could do it better. That image is the one I return to when I think about the turning point. Not because anything dramatic happened that morning. Nothing did. She gathered 3 eggs and came back inside and made breakfast, and we ate in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have learned that not every moment requires filling. But something had shifted. The axis of the household had tilted, so gradually I couldn't have pointed to the exact moment, but by November it was undeniable. Clara was no longer my patient. She was no longer the woman I'd carried off the train, the 95-pound question mark wrapped in a gray dress. She was a presence, a force. A person who occupied space in my house and my days with an authority that I hadn't granted, and she hadn't asked for. It had simply grown, the way the mesquite grows, sending roots sideways through dry ground until one day you realize it's anchored in places you didn't know soil existed. She reorganized the kitchen. I came home from the south pasture one afternoon and found every shelf rearranged, every pot relocated, every jar of dried goods lined up and labeled in her small, precise handwriting. I stood in the doorway and stared at it with the bewildered admiration of a man whose country has been quietly conquered while he was looking in the wrong direction. "The flour was next to the kerosene," she said from behind me. "That's a fire waiting to happen." "It's been next to the kerosene for 4 years." "Then you've been tempting fate for 4 years." I opened my mouth to argue, then I closed it, then I opened it again. "The cast irons moved," I said. "It was too high. You had to reach over the stove to get it. One slip and you'd have burned your forearm." "I've never burned my forearm." "Because you've been lucky. Luck is not a system, Caleb." She said this with such schoolteacher certainty, such absolute, inarguable conviction, that I felt like a student who has just been corrected on a point of grammar and knows, despite his desire to protest, that the teacher is right. I wrote in the ledger, November 6th, "Kitchen reorganized by Clara, items now in logical order, cannot find the salt. She says it's in the correct place. I disagree but lack evidence." The cough didn't disappear. I want to be clear about that. This isn't a story where the sick woman drinks a tea made by a wise healer and stands up transformed, cured, whole. Clara's lungs were damaged, and damaged things don't undamage. They adapt, they compensate. They find new ways to work around the wreckage, the way a river finds new channels when the old ones are blocked, not as efficiently, not as elegantly, but enough. She still coughed in the mornings. A short, tight cough that sounded like a door being shut firmly rather than the wet, tearing sound that had terrified me in the early weeks. She still got breathless if she moved too quickly or climbed the slope behind the house or tried to carry anything heavier than a bucket of water. There were days when the cold air hit her wrong, and she had to sit on the porch with her hand pressed flat against her chest, breathing with deliberate, measured control, each inhale a negotiation between what her lungs wanted to do and what she demanded of them. But she was alive. She was gaining weight. She was standing on her own feet and gathering eggs and reorganizing kitchens and arguing with me about the placement of cast iron, and if that doesn't sound like much, then you've never watched someone come back from the place she'd been. Nanton came once more in November. This visit was different. He didn't examine Clara. He sat on the porch with her, both of them in chairs, facing the desert with cups of the horehound tea she now brewed herself, and they talked. Not about medicine, about other things. I could hear fragments from inside the house, where I was pretending to mend a bridle, but was actually listening with the shameless attentiveness of a man who has realized that the two most interesting people in his life are having a conversation without him. She asked him about his family. He told her in his measured, precise English about his wife, who had died 8 years ago of a fever that no healer could break. He told her about his son, who had been taken to a boarding school in the East and had come back speaking a language that was technically English, but was not the English Nanton recognized. It was a flattened, emptied version of it, a language stripped of the rhythms and pauses that gave meaning to words. He said his son's silence was louder than any scream he'd ever heard. Clara told him about Gerald, about the mine, about the sound that boots don't make when the person wearing them no longer comes home, about the dust that settled into everything, the curtains, the food, the lungs, the marriage, until you couldn't tell where the dust ended and the life began. They sat together for an hour, two people who had lost different things in different ways, finding in each other not comfort exactly, but recognition. The mutual acknowledgement of damage, the quiet understanding that some wounds don't close, they just stop bleeding. When Nanton left that day, Clara watched him ride toward the hills until the Pinto was a small brown shape against the gray sage, and then she turned to me and said, "He reminds me of my father." "Your father was Apache." She looked at me with an expression that managed to be simultaneously amused and exasperated. "My father was a dairy farmer from outside Columbus. He had red hair and a beard, and he whistled hymns while he milked. He was nothing like Nanton in any visible way. But the way Nanton listens, the way he holds still and lets the silence do the work, my father did that. Most people rush to fill the quiet. My father and Nanton, they trust it." I thought about this. I thought about the silences between me and Clara, which had grown from awkward to comfortable to something I didn't have a word for, a silence that was not the absence of speech but the presence of understanding. A silence that said, "I'm here, you're here, that's enough." "I don't trust silence," I said. "I fill it with counting." "I know you count everything, fence posts, rivets, breaths, words. It keeps things orderly. It keeps you from feeling." I looked at her, she looked back, green eyes, direct, unflinching. "Maybe," I said. "There was a moment in late November that I have to tell you about, not because it changed anything, but because it didn't. And sometimes the things that don't change are the ones that matter most." I was in the barn mucking stalls. It was late afternoon, cold, the light going amber the way it does in winter when the sun drops behind the mesa and throws its last colors sideways across the land. Clara was in the house. Bishop was with Clara. The horses were stamping in their stalls, and the air smelled like hay and manure and the sharp, clean bite of approaching cold. Harlan Briggs rode up. Harlan was my neighbor to the south, 5 miles across open range. He was the one who told me to write the advertisement. He was a good man, loud, opinionated, fond of whiskey and unsolicited advice, but fundamentally decent in the way that matters when you live in a place where decency can mean the difference between survival and ruin. He dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and walked into the barn with the bow-legged swagger of a man who has spent more of his life on a horse than off one. "Heard you got yourself a wife," he said. "News travels. Everything travels out here. There's nothing else to do." He leaned against a stall post and crossed his arms. "Also heard she came off the train sick as a cat in a rainstorm, and you carried her like a feed sack." "She weighs more than a feed sack." "Now maybe. Clyde at the station said she looked like a stiff breeze would take her. Said you had flowers, said you dropped 'em." He grinned. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard of you doing, Caleb, and it's still pathetic." "Thank you, Harlan." He was quiet for a moment, then, "How is she?" "Better. Getting stronger." "Good," another pause, longer. "Listen, I got to say something and you're not going to like it." "Then don't say it." "People are talking, in town, about the Apache." I stopped shoveling, set the shovel against the wall, turned to face him. "What about the Apache?" "About Nanton, about him coming to your place, about him being inside your house with your wife." Harlan held up both hands. "I'm just the messenger, Caleb. I don't give a damn who you have in your house." "But Emmett Sutter and the boys at the stockyard, they're not as broad-minded as I am, and Emmett's been running his mouth about white women and Indian medicine. And what? And he used the word indecent, which is rich coming from a man who's been run out of 2 territories for cheating at cards and has a relationship with his whiskey bottle that I'd describe as deeply personal. I stood there. The amber light was fading. The cold was coming in through the barn door, and I could feel it on my face, on my hands, on the back of my neck. Nanton saved her life, I said. I know that, you know that. Nanton knows that. Emmett Sutter doesn't know it and wouldn't care if he did, because Emmett Sutter is a small man in a big hat who thinks that the color of a person's skin tells you everything you need to know about the content of their character, and nothing I say or you say will change that. Then what are you suggesting? Harlan took off his hat and rubbed the back of his head. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's being said. What you do with it is your business. He left. I finished the stalls. I walked back to the house in the dark, and Clara was at the kitchen table reading one of the books she'd brought in her carpet bag. A worn copy of Jane Eyre that she'd read so many times the spine was cracked, and the pages fell open to certain passages on their own, as though the book remembered where she liked to linger. She looked up. You're upset. I'm fine. You're counting. Your lips are moving. You count when you're upset. I sat down across from her. I told her what Harlan had said. I told her about Emmett Sutter and the stockyard talk and the word indecent. I told her all of it because Clara was not a person you protected from truth. She was a person who required truth the way her lungs required clean air as a non-negotiable condition of survival. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she closed the book and placed both hands flat on the table and looked at me with those green eyes, and she said, "What are you going to do? What do you think I should do?" I think you should do exactly what you've been doing. Nothing different, nothing less. Emmett Sutter could make trouble. Emmett Sutter is trouble, has been from what you've told me since before I arrived. The question isn't whether he makes trouble. The question is whether his trouble changes who you are. I looked at her, this woman. This thin, fierce, green-eyed woman who had arrived in my life unable to stand, and was now sitting at my table telling me, with the calm authority of a person who has survived worse things than small-town gossip, that the only opinion that mattered was the one I held about myself. It doesn't, I said. Good, then it's settled. It's not settled, it's just... It's settled, Caleb. She opened the book again. Now stop counting and eat your supper. 2 weeks later, Emmett Sutter rode onto my property. He came with 3 men. They arrived at mid-morning, when I was in the north pasture, checking the fence line I'd finally decided to repair. Clara's logic about the south pasture had been irrefutable, and I'd spent the better part of a week digging post holes and stringing wire until my hands bled and my back screamed and the fence was done. I saw them coming across the flat from half a mile away, 4 riders in a line, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of men who want to be seen. I rode back to the house. Clara was on the porch. Bishop was beside her, standing stiff-legged with his hackles raised, his one ear flat against his skull. She had a hand on his collar. Go inside, I said. No. Clara. I said no. Sutter pulled up at the fence. He was a thick man with a face that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts, small eyes, wide jaw, a nose that had been broken at least twice. He wore a colt on his hip in a way that was too visible to be practical, which told me it was there for show. Mercer, he said. Sutter. Heard you've been entertaining. Indians in your house. Medicine man, that kind of thing. I've been doing what I need to do for my family. Your family, he said the word with a twist that turned it into something ugly. That sick girl you pulled off the train, that's your family. Clara stepped forward, 1 step, just one, but it was enough to draw every eye. My name is Clara Mercer, she said. Her voice was steady, clear. The cough was there underneath. I could hear it, the slight rasp at the bottom of each breath, but she held it back with the same jaw-clenched determination she'd used to sit up in bed on the 4th day. And if you've come here to discuss who enters our home, I'll save you the trouble. It's not your concern. Sutter looked at her, then at me, then back at her. Ma'am, this isn't about. It's about exactly what I said. Who enters our home, who heals under our roof, who we break bread with and whose knowledge we trust with our lives. That is not your concern, Mr. Sutter. It never was. It never will be. There was a silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room, or in this case, a sun-baked yard in the middle of New Mexico territory, reshapes itself around a statement that cannot be argued with, not because it's loud, but because it's true. One of Sutter's men, a younger one on the left, shifted in his saddle. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had come expecting one thing and found another, and the other was making him reconsider the first. Sutter's jaw worked. I could see him chewing on a response, trying to find the angle, the leverage, the word that would reassert his authority over a situation that had slipped away from him the moment Clara opened her mouth. He didn't find it. "This isn't over, Mercer," he said, which was the kind of thing men say when something is very clearly over, and they can't admit it. He turned his horse. His men followed. They rode back across the flat, and I watched them until they were small shapes against the sage, and then I turned to Clara. She was shaking, not with fear, with the adrenaline aftermath of a person who has done a thing they weren't sure they could do and is now dealing with the physiological consequences of their own courage. Her hands were trembling. Her breath was short. Bishop was leaning against her legs with his full weight, pressing himself into her the way dogs do when they sense distress. "Clara Mercer," I said. She looked at me. "You said Clara Mercer." A pause, then that ghost smile, stronger now, almost real. "I did. There hasn't been a ceremony, a preacher, anything." "I know. So technically, I traveled 1,800 miles, nearly died on a train, was carried off a platform by a man who dropped his flowers, was nursed back to health by that man, and his one-eared dog and an Apache healer who doesn't believe in payment, and I've been living in this man's house for 2 months eating his terrible bread. If that's not a marriage, Caleb, I don't know what is." I stood on the porch of my ranch, our ranch, and I looked at this woman, and I felt the thing I'd been counting my way around since September. The thing I'd hidden in columns of numbers and carefully recorded temperatures and observations about the color of stones. The thing I'd written around in ledger entries that described everything except what mattered. I didn't say it, I didn't have the words for it yet, but she saw it. She saw it in the same way Nanton saw what was happening inside her lungs, not through the surface, not through the symptoms, but through some deeper sense that recognized the truth of a thing before the thing itself was ready to be spoken. She took my hand. Her fingers were still trembling. My fingers were still, because the thing that was too serious for shaking had arrived again, and it was steadying me in ways I didn't understand. "I need to write this down," I said. She laughed, that real laugh, the one that sounded like rain. "Of course you do." That night I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the pencil in my hand and the fire burning low and Clara asleep in the bedroom. Our bedroom, I was beginning to think of it, though the thought still startled me each time, and I tried to record the events of the day. I wrote November 29th. Sutter came with 3 men. Clara spoke to them. They left. But that wasn't right. That was the skeleton of the thing, not the thing itself. The words were true, but they were empty, the way a house is empty when the fire goes out and the people leave, still standing, still holding its shape, but missing the warmth that made it worth entering. I crossed it out. I tried again. November 29th. Clara called herself Clara Mercer today. She stood on the porch and she was not afraid. Or she was afraid and she stood anyway, which is not the same thing as courage, but is closer to it than anything I've ever done. Better, but still not right. I tried a 3rd time. The pencil was dull now, the point worn flat from pressing too hard, and the letters came out thick and blurred, but I wrote. November 29th. I carried her off the train on September 14th. She weighed 95 pounds. Today she weighs more. I don't know how much because I don't own a scale, and it doesn't matter because the weight I'm measuring isn't the kind that scales can hold. She came here to breathe. I think she came here to live. I think she came here to stand on a porch and say her name out loud and mean it. I think I placed a 47-word advertisement in a newspaper and a life showed up. Not the life I planned. Not the life I expected. Better. Harder. Realer. A life with coughing and bad bread and reorganized kitchens and a one-eared dog who chose her over me and an old healer in the hills who taught me that leaving salt on a fence post is not generosity, but investment in something I couldn't see until I needed it. Nanton said she was bent, not broken. He was right, but he didn't say the rest. He didn't say that the man doing the carrying gets bent too. Not by the wait, by the watching, by the hoping, by the slow, unbearable, extraordinary process of watching someone decide to live. I put the pencil down, I closed the ledger. In the bedroom, Clara coughed once that short, tight sound, a door closing, and then was quiet. Bishop was lying across the threshold of the bedroom door, the way he did every night, his head on his paws, his one ear turned toward the sound of her breathing. He looked at me with the calm, unsurprised expression of an animal who had understood, long before I did, that the woman in the bed was the center of the house, and that his job and mine was simply to... I banked the fire. I checked the door. I walked past Bishop, who thumped his tail once against the floor in acknowledgement, and I lay down beside Clara in the dark. She shifted, her hand found mine under the blanket. Her fingers were warm. "Stop counting," she murmured, half asleep, her voice like smoke. "I'm not counting. Your lips are moving. I'm praying." A pause, then barely audible. "You don't pray." "I'm learning." Her fingers tightened around mine. The room was dark. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, the wind moved across the mesa with the sound of something vast and patient, something that had been moving across this land for 1,000 years before I arrived and would go on moving for 1,000 years after I was gone.